Welcome back from our break. We're now moving into the final set of lectures and responses. And this final set will begin with John Sanders and then a response with Shabir Ally. John, would you, I think I've shared screen with you, I made you a co-host. So if you're ready to go, would you give us a little introduction and then launch into your lecture?
Thank you, everyone, for participating in the conference. I've enjoyed it so much. So I'm now retired from professor as religious studies at Hendrix College. And I'm one of the people who's helped develop a school of thought called Open Theism. And let me just say that from the very beginning, Clark Pinnock and I thought of this as a broader understanding of God in which would emphasize relationality, and not the issue of foreknowledge per se, but more about relationality. And so this led me into my research in the social sciences here. And the last thing I'll mention is that I had the distinct privilege of being the colleague of Jay McDaniel for a number of years. I miss our conversations, Jay. Okay, now I'm going to try to share my screen and the PowerPoint here. Okay, so a number of social scientists have identified two major value systems that orient our way of life. And for over 30 years, political scientists have used 4 questions about traits we prefer in children to identify these two types of values. So one of them is independence or respect for elders, good manners or curiosity, whether you prefer children who are well-behaved or considerate, self-reliant or obedient. Those who choose independence, curiosity, being considerate, and self-reliance are what researchers call strongly nurturant. Those who select respect for elders, good manners, well-behaved, and obedience are called strongly authoritative. Researchers call these 4 questions the Rosetta Stone and use them, for instance, in the World Values Survey of 108 countries representing 90% of the world's population. Why? Because the answers correlate accurately to questions or to views that you have, from the type of books and movies you like to the stances on a host of political and social issues, such as should women have a role in the public sphere. Now, here are the cores of the two models. Nurturants emphasize empathy, cooperation, perspective taking, importance of communities, and they're comfortable with the need for nuance and qualification. They think of justice as ensuring that all people have a solid opportunity to fulfill their potential in life. Authoritative core values are obedience to rules, maintaining the social order, individual responsibility, and what psychologists call cognitive closure. That is, they're certain about their views. And for them, justice is getting what you deserve. If you follow the rules, well, you deserve a reward. If you break the rules, you deserve punishment. My recent book, Embracing Prodigals, applies these social science categories to a number of Christian teachings, and then to some political and social issues. And so I'm going to summarize those. And I might say that this morning I just mentioned the connection between one's view of God and ethics, and that's exactly what I see going on here. So the nurturant view of God. God has high expectations for the way we should live. God manifests acceptance and mercy and grace to get us to change the way we live. Divine justice seeks to enable all people to flourish. God loves, cares for everyone, regardless of their faults, even those outside the religious community. God takes human concerns into account, such as the traditional thinking about prayer. Those who believe in the nurturing God use these adjectives when researchers ask them. God is forgiving, gracious, loving, accepting, not controlling, helping, caring, compassionate, generous, merciful, and tolerant. The authoritative view of God says we must first change, and then God will accept us. Divine justice gives everyone what they deserve. You follow the rules, you go to heaven. You disobey and veer from the straight path, you go to hell. God loves the religious community and hates others. And this has, of course, there's variations of all of these. God does not take human concerns into account. As one very prominent evangelical theologian pointed his finger at me and said, "Who do you think you are to advise God?" Those who affirm the authoritative God tell researchers they describe God as critical, punishing, judging, stern, wrathful, damning, disapproving, controlling, rigid, strict, and unforgiving. Now, as a little side note here, philosophers speak of great-making properties, and often this involves things like strong impassibility. And for many authoritativs, it means total control over others, what I call meticulous providence. However, if one begins with the values of Jesus, different great-making properties can be selected. For Islam, you could consider the Bismillah. Each surah of the Quran begins in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. For me, compassion and mercy are superior great-making properties to unchangeability. In addition, consider some of the 99 names of God, such as forgiving, patient, guide, and Al-Mujib, the responsive one. Such great-making properties cohere well with open and relational theology. A God with compassion who forgives those who stray from the path is greater, in my view, than the strongly impassible deity who lacks compassion. What about sin? Nurturance frames sin in relational terms. It's about harming and breaking relationships. Authoritators think of sin as breaking rules that require punishment. Forgiveness, for nurturance, God simply forgives and uses it to motivate us to change and transform. For authoritators, humans must first change and then God will accept them. When it comes to salvation of non-believers, this has been a topic in both Christianity and Islam for many centuries. Authoritators say God doesn't seek to save non-believers. God gave the rules of salvation. Heaven is restricted to those who follow the divine instructions. And this is just because people get what they deserve. Nurturants say, well, of course God wants to save non-believers. And they have different views and ideas about how this comes about. What about hell? For authoritatives, hell is eternal conscious punishment. And people are aware of the torment. And it lasts forever. God locks the gates of hell to keep people from escaping. Now, nurturants, not all nurturants, of course, believe in a hell, but they all find the idea of an eternal torture chamber incompatible with God's love and justice. What purpose does punishing people forever accomplish except vindictiveness? The purpose of judgment is to transform people. Big Boyd asked me that question. How does judgment fit in to nurturant? It's to transform people. It's to change them. And there's various views on the nature of hell and what God does in response there. The Bible and the Quran, nurturants and authoritatives also have different views about sacred texts. Nurturants see them as ways of grace to shape our communities, an invitation to a way of life, not a list of rules to memorize. And a community is open to using the best human reasoning in dialogue with sacred texts. So it's a dialogue. Okay? This is very different from authoritatives who see the text as a rule book for how to live. There are absolutes. God said it, you got to believe it, and that settles it. As one pastor put it to me, why did you, Sanders, put a question mark where God put a period? So, you follow the rules and life turns out well for you. And sacred texts always have priority over human reasoning. And I'll be very interested in our Muslim colleagues, they have to say about this. In terms of what is called cognitive styles or ways of relating, nurturants believe it's virtuous to foster dialogue, perspective taking. Authoritatives, however, tend not to value perspective taking. The only reason to learn a position like, if you're a Christian, why you learn about Islam is to show why it's wrong. Nurturants practice what psychologists call a pilgrim or quest theology. It's on a journey. It's open to changes. Authoritatives prefer what's called a fortress theology. We've already figured out the truth, and now we just have to defend it against everyone else. Nurturants use epistemic humility in their truth claims. They make truth claims. Okay. They're not total relativists. They make truth claims. But there is humility and a need for qualification. Authoritatives tend to hold their views with absolute certainty. They prefer black and white thinking without qualification. And though nurturants reject some positions, there's usually what I call a constrained pluralism of acceptable views, a range of views, like maybe 3 to 5 views on a topic. Authoritatives score high on what psychologists call a defensive theology scale. There's only one correct view. And even though evangelicals are right, there must be like 40 or 50 of these books called, Perspectives on, right? Yeah. And each one claims to be the correct view, but they can't settle it. And if you don't agree with the single correct view, then you must be removed from the community. Monad Khorshid and I have personal experience with this. Nurturants affirm the importance of dialogue and are willing to compromise. Authoritatives place little value in dialogue and see compromise as selling out. So let's look at some social and political issues very quickly here. Criminal justice. So different views on hell correspond to different approaches to criminal punishment. Authoritatives say we must be tough on crime, espouse the death penalty, and generally want to lock up criminals and throw away the key, because God does that. Nurturants, however, seek to restore the offender to the community because the purpose of judgment is to get people to change. The wealth gap. There's a huge wealth gap in America, principally upon and a lot along racial lines. And authoritative Christians claim that whites deserve higher incomes and net worth because they work harder. And they criticize Black Christians for relying upon systems to help them. If everyone would just work harder, they would get out of poverty. And it's interesting that authoritatives often tell researchers that they are poor because God is punishing them for their sin. Nurturants believe that the government should change the economic laws to ensure that everyone can fulfill their potential. On healthcare, nurturants believe, hey, just like good roads and schools help a society, all should be provided with healthcare. But authoritatives think of healthcare as a commodity. It's just like a car, or as Rudy Giuliani said, a big screen TV. Only the successful and the wealthy can afford it. In terms of governance, nurturants prefer democratic or shared governance and deliberative discourse so that all people have a say in what's going on. But authoritatives favor autocratic leaders. Nurturants say it's important for democracies to protect the rights of those with unpopular views or people to criticize leaders and protest. Authoritatives tend to disagree. Many affirm, and this was from a 2017 research, they want a strong leader who does not have to bother with Congress or elections. It's interesting the way they define strong there. Now, I've basically been descriptive, but there's also a normative claim being made here. So studies from various countries show that children raised by nurturing parents and educators are much better off in these ways. They have less mental health issues, they're more pro-social, and in self-control. And those who believe in a nurturing God, okay, just believe that idea, are more likely to help others and cooperate. Nurturants have significantly higher levels of conviction that their life has meaning, and they have less mental issues. And finally, studies have shown that states and societies, even countries that are more nurturant, have lower death rates from natural disasters and infectious diseases. And so I believe that open and relational process theology, there's many forms of relational thinking, are going to be more helpful in affirming nurturant religion. And so in my discussions, for instance, with Muslims in Tehran, I believe open theism, because I'm a proponent of that, is one way of trying to help reach a more nurturant religion. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Powerful stuff. I'm sure that's going to generate lots of questions, responses, insights. Let's go first to, of course, Shabir Ali for a response.
Yeah.
Would you give us a brief introduction to yourself as you respond to John?
A pleasure to be with you all here from around the globe and learning from all of you academics and scholars. My name is Shabir Ali. I'm located in Toronto, where I serve as a faith leader in a mosque community. As part of our community outreach, we have a television program called Let the Quran Speak, which is shown on Canadian television, but it's also available on the web. Our site for that is QuranSpeaks.com. So shall I begin my presentation then? Well, rather my speech. I've typed it all up so that I can share this paper with you later on. So I've entitled it Nurturant and Authoritative Views of God in dialogue with Dr. John Sanders. I begin with praise for God. I pray for all the prophets of God and us all. Dr. Sanders has shown a sharp contrast between the nurturant and authoritative views of God and the social impact of these views. I find myself agreeing with almost everything that he presented. He has alluded to some elements of the Muslim faith that could support the nurturant view, such as the name of God, Ar-Rahman, the most merciful. I did not find much in his presentation pertaining to the problem of predestination, the history of which within Christian circles he traced so adequately in his essay in the book, The Openness of God, edited by Clark Pinnock and others. It remains for me to address this problem from a Muslim perspective. If I had more time, I would have advanced a progressive view of God's embracing of prodigals, a view of the limited duration of hell, and the salvation of non-Muslims, subjects which Dr. Sanders elaborated with such eloquence. However, given the limited time, I prefer to address what I feel is at the crossroads between the nurturant and authoritative views, the question of predestination. Given its complexity, I feel that predestination needs to be addressed as thoroughly as possible. First, I must acknowledge that Muslims have always been torn between views on predestination and human freedom. However, the faith, as classically formulated, opted for the predestinarian view. This formulation is reflected in Islamic law, exegesis, and theology, all of which find validation in hadith, which themselves developed in tandem with Muslim thought in the said fields. The tension that Muslims felt between these two paradigms is reflected in the hadith, according to which a non-Muslim child had died. The story involves Aisha, respectfully referred to as the mother of the believers, and at the mention of whose name Sunni Muslims tend to say, may God be pleased with her. She remarked affectionately that the deceased child is now one of the little birds in paradise. But the Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace, interjected. He explained that Allah knows what the child would have done. The hadith ends there, but it has set the stage for the inference that the child could have grown up to be a sinner, and God, knowing the sins in advance, may punish the departed soul of the child. That God's foreknowledge underpins a deterministic universe became commonplace in Sunni Muslim theology, though this was not always the case. At one time, those now dubbed Qadarites, or Qadaris, argued for human freedom and divine justice as being predicated upon that concept. The Qadaris were followed by or evolved into the Mu'tazilis, the rationalists, whose rational approaches have survived somewhat in Shiite Muslim circles. But Sunnis mostly went the way of Abul Hasan al-Ash'ari. The latter had mastered Mu'tazilite thought, but turned away from using rationality as a determinant of truth. Rather, he became content using rationality merely to defend the truth, which is known from hadith or more broadly Muslim tradition. If everything is predestined, why, according to al-Ash'ari, would punishment of sinners be justified? Because, he says, sinners acquire the sin which God had already chalked out for them. The justification seems lame, but the Ash'arite school became the hallmark of Muslim scholarship into the Middle Ages. Muslims struggle with the concept of divine determinism today, with most Muslims sensing that there is a problem with the doctrine. Muslim savants, sensing the doubts among the masses, tend to double down, insisting on the doctrine in sermons, fatwas, and treatises. However, Muslims today can find a way out of this difficulty by looking more closely at the early evolution of Muslim thought. The earliest and most reliable document for Muslims in determining faith and practice is the Quran. The Quran, no doubt, has passages that can't be interpreted in a deterministic manner. However, there are mitigating verses pointing to human freedom. For example, let those who wish to believe, believe, and let those who wish to disbelieve, disbelieve. That's Quran chapter 18, verse 27. This points to human choice. Not only this verse, but the Quran as a whole resounds with this message. People have the choice to believe or not. It is true that the Quran uses the term qadr, which acquired the meaning of predestination in Muslim theology. But the term needs to mean only a measure. The Quranic message seems to be that God has measured out everything. But this does not need to mean that things are not measured out in ranges. Hence, a person's lifespan, for example, could have been measured out in advance as a range. Thus, people could live longer with proper diet, exercise, and advances in medical treatment. All of this would be within the qadr, the range of divine premeasurement. It is easy, even for those who do not speak Arabic, to appreciate that qadr does not mean predestination, at least in Quran 22, verse 74. Leaving the word qadr untranslated for the moment, the verse faults non-believers because they do not qadr God with the qadr that God deserves. If qadr means predestination, the verse would be blaming non-believers for not predestining God as he deserves to be predestined. Rather, qadr means here measure. Hence, the verse means they have not measured God with the measure God deserves. Or, to put it simply, they do not properly esteem God. In sum, the Quran does not support the theory of absolute predestination. Though it presents God as being in control, God maintains also human freedom within broad controls. But the hadith corpuses are more difficult to tweak towards establishing human freedom. These corpuses each commonly include a chapter on the subject, chock full of snippets, like the one about the deceased child mentioned earlier, establishing absolute divine control of each person's outcome. Yet even these corpuses contain traditions that go against the grain in showing that things are not as predestined as the other traditions insist. For example, in Sahih al-Bukhari, widely regarded among Muslims as the most authentic collection of hadith, some hadiths appear in more than one version. This probably due to variations occurring, especially in the early, mostly oral stage of transmission. The two competing versions of a hadith differ mainly in a single word. Either it uses the word "and" to conjoin heaven and hell, or it uses the word "or" to disjoin the two outcomes. Basically, in the variation that supports determinism, the hadith indicates that when people pass away from this life and await the judgment, they are shown in advance their place that is reserved for them, either in paradise or in hell. But the variant indicates that people are shown their reserved dwellings in paradise and in hell. This means that two places have been slated for each individual, and the life we live determines which of the two places we inhabit in the end. Unfortunately, the variant championed by the evolved classical tradition is the one that favors determinism. But the other variant is still there in Sahih al-Bukhari, waiting to be reclaimed as a variant that goes against the grain of the traditions, and for this reason is probably more authentic than its competitor. If we allow our critical eye to return to the story of the deceased child, we can see that the hadith on the story is in two distinct parts. In the first part, Aisha declared that the child is now a bird in paradise. In the second part, Muhammad, peace be upon him, expresses caution about such a conclusion. Given what we know about form critical studies, this second part could have been appended to the first part, which conceivably it could have circulated devoid of the second part. If that is so, then Aisha's conclusion would have been the only one. The child is in heaven. But then someone thought it necessary to reverse that conclusion so as to support the then developing predestinarian view. In sum, While the Hadith corpuses developed at a time and in circles in which predestination was the accepted theory and can be expected to support that view, there are indications in the corpuses that this was not always the view among Muslims. In fact, we know more broadly from historical studies of the existence of the Qadarites, advocates of human freedom, and the Mu'tazilis, rationalists who rejected stark determinism. Hence, Muslims today are not predestined to accept predestination as a necessary component of our faith. Rather, we can reclaim the balance between human freedom and divine controls, allowing for such freedom within broad parameters. If we can strike this balance, then we will be able to develop a nurturing theology. Knowing that God is nurturing, not micromanaging, will empower us to align ourselves with God's plans in nurturing and caring for creation. Embracing a nurturing approach rather than an authoritative one will also have major social implications. Imagine a Muslim world with less authority and more egalitarianism, less monarchy, more democracy. In conclusion, I applaud Dr. Sanders for his enlightening dichotomization between the nurturant and authoritative views. I felt that if he was allotted more time, he might have also included much mention of determinism as a component of the authoritarian approach. Hence, I hope that my humble contribution will be seen as a student's addendum to Dr. Sanders' excellent presentation. Had time allowed, I would have also advanced a progressive view on the temporality of hell, the salvation of non-Muslims, and God's embracing of prodigals. But perhaps these will arise in the ensuing discussion. May the merciful God, Ar-Rahman, be with you all.
Thank you so much. Beautiful response. Great things for us to ponder and discuss together. I've been watching the chat box as both of you have been speaking, and several of the comments from Asina, Mohana, Jay, and others are embracing this notion of an Islam that's nurturant. And Shabir, you gave us one strategy toward coming closer to that by a particular textual criticism or textual interpretation of the Quran on these passages that can be interpreted as predestinarian. But let me just sort of foist the broad question to both of you. What are some other kinds of things or approaches, practices, habits, ways of thinking that might compel Muslims to have a more nurturant approach to reality, to God, to the way they see government, personal lives, etc.? John, why don't you start with that, since Shabir just got finished, and let him collect his thoughts. I know you're not speaking for Muslims, John, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
So I've been having conversations, for instance, with scholars at the Islamic Research Institute in Tehran, and with students and faculty at oh no, I lost the name of the university in Tehran. But one of the things that's interested me is in both conversations. I think what motivates divine determinism, I think Shabir has brought up a very important point. What motivates divine determinism, meticulous providence, predestination, is the view that God is timeless, unconditioned, and strongly immutable. So that's why I have, in my conversations with these scholars in Tehran, talked about, they affirm these things. And I say, well, wait a minute. But then they also turn around and say, but we affirm human free will. And I'm like, whoa, we've got some problems here. And some of the scholars there at Sharif University, one of them in particular is working on criticizing the Muslim Islamic philosophical affirmation of strong immutability and impassibility. And he's using open theism to do that. He sees that as a means. Now, the broader goal eventually is, of course, to apply it to social and political issues. But if God is in total control of everything, why? Because the divine nature mandates it. It cannot be otherwise. And so that's why I have fronted my conversations with really trying to get at determinism regarding the divine nature. And then the second thing I say about that is that the authoritative view of leadership and authority itself is wrong-headed. A nurturant view has authorities. Okay, Jesus is an authority in the Christian tradition. Muhammad is an authority in the Muslim tradition. Okay, that's fine. But the way you understand the authorities is where the difference comes about. So leadership in a nurturant context versus leadership in authoritative context. Authorities see God as a certain way, and they say, well, we're emulating God. This is the way God does it. So that's the first thing I'd say. But now I forgot the rest of your question.
Okay, that's all right. Shabir, you want to weigh in there?
I mean, there's several factors in Dr. Sanders' presentation. He spoke about the Muslim view that God is Ar-Rahman, the merciful one. We can expound upon that a little bit more, especially in light of his book, Embracing Prodigals. The Islamic faith actually teaches us, the Quran goes on and on about this. And in fact, the Hadith, while I've shown a contrast between the Quranic view on predestination and the Hadith's approach, both Quran and Hadith are together in saying that God is merciful. And the Quran describes God as being Linnasir la Ra'uf Rahim. He is it's difficult to translate. One might say that he is full of loving kindness towards humankind. And the Hadith, elaborating on that verse in the Quran, which is found in the second chapter, I believe the verse number is 143. The Hadith relates that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was with his companions, and they noticed a woman who was frantically looking for her baby. And when she finally found her baby, she brought that baby to her chest and began to nurse that baby. So the Prophet turned to his companions and asked them, do you think that this woman could bear to throw her baby into a fire? And they said, well, of course not. And he said, well, God is more merciful towards human beings than this woman is to her baby. So that is the nurturing view that, is there in the Quran, in the Hadith, and could have been cultivated in Muslim societies and still is. This Hadith is spoken about, the Quranic verses mentioned in sermons and so on repeatedly. So these sorts of things need to be highlighted more. And that would help to nurture more of the nurturant view among Muslims.
I love it. One set of the questions has to do with topics both of you raised, and that is, how do we think about the afterlife, heaven, hell, annihilation, purgatory, whatever is going on there? John, you've made the claim that authoritatives lean into the hell question, where the nurturants maybe would believe in hell, but only as some sort of a transformative thing, or maybe that's purgatory. Greg Boyd would like to hear you both kind of ruminate on those issues a bit. Shabir, let's start with you this time, and then we'll go to John.
Yeah. So hell in the classical Muslim tradition is, that's it's either heaven or hell. Our deeds are all recorded. They will all be shown to us on the day of judgment. Lucky are those who do not have to face reckoning for what they have done, because God has forgiven them all. Those who have sought forgiveness in this life would be forgiven by God. Those who have not sought forgiveness can still be forgiven by God. If one is not ultimately forgiven, then one goes into hell to punish for one's sins. And Dr. Sanders, spoke about the cleansing nature of hell. In the Islamic faith, there is an understanding too that if Muslims enter hell, it'll be a sort of a purgatory. It is a cleansing, and then one is dipped in the water of life and eventually put into paradise forever. But what about the fate of non-Muslims? So it was thought that non-Muslims would be in hell forever. But in my humble view, this is not a necessarily Muslim view. And Dr. Sanders has made mention of Muhammad Khalil's book, The Fate of Others, which I've yet to read, but I suspect that my ideas are similar to what he has expounded. now, as for the duration of hell, it was widely acknowledged among Muslims that hell is of a permanent duration. But some of our classical scholars are known to have been well placed in Muslim scholarship and yet have held the view that hell is temporary. One such scholar is Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah, the famous student of the also famous teacher Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn al-Qayyim, in his book Hadi al-Arwah ila bilad al-Afrah, which means something like urging the souls towards the land of happiness, he has a whole chapter giving multiple reasons. Some of them are repetitive or the same reason looked at from a different facet. But he gives something like 25 reasons arguing in favor of the temporary duration of hell, in contrast with heaven, which for him has to be permanent. And he backs that up with mention of Quranic verses and hadith and so on. So that in a nutshell, I think might be an answer to your question. Let me know if you'd like any further elaboration.
Yeah, that's really helpful. John, you want to weigh in on this?
Very briefly. So the book Muhammad Khalil, Islam and the Fate of the Others, Oxford 2012, is a book that surveys the range of views on Muslim views of non-Muslims. Right? On hell, I haven't read any literature by Muslim scholars on it, but I would be shocked if the history of discussion in Islamic thought does not mirror the discussion in Christian thought and the range of views that have been put out. I would be shocked if it does not.
Yeah, I would too. I suspect there's lots of parallels. Yeah. You know, Shabir, you mentioned Ibn Taymiyyah, who's one of my favorites, and his view of hell perhaps being having a limit. That gets us to some questions that have been showing up in the chat box related to God's relation to time and foreknowledge and middle knowledge and the metazelites and all that sort of stuff. Johannes Grosso asks about the story of the three brothers and whether that requires makes us embrace middle knowledge view that somehow God knows what's going to happen but doesn't determine it. Michael Lodahl asks about the status of the metazelites in terms of open theists. Let's start again with you, Shabir, and then go to John. Comments on God's relation to time in Islam or in Christianity and why that matters.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so first, let me clarify, if you don't mind, Thomas, that I was only attributing the view on the temporality of hell to Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah, not to his teacher Ibn Taymiyyah. Though of course, no, you're not wrong in that some have attributed the view to Ibn Taymiyyah as well. But because of Ibn Taymiyyah's great placement in our history, is many of his followers would want to deny that the view was his. I see. So to avoid controversy, I've only attributed to Ibn Taymiyyah, and that's good enough because Ibn Taymiyyah is himself well placed in our history. As for questions about God and time, I have to admit my ignorance in that area. In general, I'm not well studied in philosophy. I've thought a lot and deeply about the question of predestination, which is a philosophical issue. But for that, I've been able to study, verses of the Quran and Hadith that deal with the question. On the question of time, I don't even know where to begin. So I apologize for being unable to deal with that in any great detail.
Yeah, no problem. John, you want to weigh in? And then if there are any other Muslim scholars who want to weigh in on God and time in Islam, send me a note in the private chat and I'll have you add. John?
Yeah, so Professor Azadegan at Sharif University in Tehran has a wonderful article on against immutability. And he's particularly working with the tremendously influential Muslim philosopher Ibn Sina. And he argues that this is the crux. You've got to get rid of total strong immutability in the Godhead. Now, he's aware that this is going to affect divine temporality, divine timelessness, etc. As Nicholas Wolterstorff said, it's like a thread. You begin to pull on one of these divine attributes of classical theism, and the rest come along with them. So this is beginning I know a number of Muslim thinkers who are working on this. In the Shia tradition, the concept of Bada has come up. A question whether God can change the divine mind, and the chronic texts, etc., that deal with this. And what I'm fascinated with is that the explanations of those texts are exactly the same as you find in Judaism and Christianity. The range of interpretations of like, no, God never changed the divine mind. That's impossible. Okay. Versus, no, God changed the divine mind. And that's possible. Oh, well, okay. If you say that, then these other implications follow. So I think that there are ways, and it's going to take experts in Islam to deal with that, not people like such as I to do that. I'm just hearing things and going, oh my goodness, I think you could use this or that. And so I make, suggestions. But I'm not a scholar of Islam to really lead the way on this.
Good. All right, I'm going to. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, Thomas, if you allow me, I do have a further thought on that.
Okay.
On that question. So I wouldn't say, from my humble understanding, that God changes his mind. I don't think that is required in anything that I presented. What I'm thinking is that God allows for human freedom within broad parameters. So, if somebody ends up in hell, this is already part of God's program, but it's only one of the possibilities that God already knew in advance that this could occur. So God knows if we make this choice, then that could lead to so many other possibilities. And if you pick one of those possibilities, then it leads to other possibilities. And he knows all of the possibilities, all of the links, the entire interconnected web of all future possibilities. And all of these future possibilities is what he himself created. So he knows them all. And only what he knows is possible. Because he himself determined what possibilities can exist. But within that web of possibilities, human beings do have full freedom to operate, or we can say limited freedom to choose among various possibilities. So whether we choose good or bad, that's all within what we call the qadr of God. An interesting story in Islamic history illustrates this point, I believe. It mentions that Umar bin al-Khattab, who is now known as the second caliph of Islam, avoided going into a place where an epidemic had broken out. And someone said to him, are you running away from the qadr of God, the predestination, according to what this hadith seems to indicate? And so he said, no, I'm running away from the qadr of God to the qadr of God, which means that no matter which path I take, whether I go into the stricken region or I stay out of it, either one is the qadr of God. So I take that to mean that whatever possibilities we choose, these are all within God's predetermination. But God's predetermination is not such that we must do this or must do that. And if he does determine something which is still within his prerogative, then that is not something that we're going to be held responsible for. And looking more closely at Johannes's question, he was asking about the story of the three brothers, and that threw me a little off because I only recall a story about two brothers. So if we have time, I can say something about that.
Okay. Let me mention to you that in the open and relational community, there are a number of ways to talk about God's relation to time and knowledge and the future. And you just described one of the ways in which open and relational folks talk about God knowing all the possibilities and that sort of thing, and yet not predetermining everything. So you're talking like an open theist, at least in some forms.
And I must say, Thomas, that before I became aware of the open theist community, I had already ran into difficulty with my own community with some of my musings about predestination. And when I stumbled upon the open theism, a lot of what is said there resonated with me. And in fact, as I listened to, I read Dr. Sanders's paper before his presentation today, and as I read it, I felt that everything he's saying is what I already believed. It's just that I didn't put these names to the beliefs. I did not draw that distinction between the authoritative and the nurturant in the way he so excellently did. but that was already there in my thinking. So we think alike.
Yeah. Well, we should do a whole conference sometime about all of us who've got in trouble with our communities. That would be an interesting discussion. I have something I would like everyone who is listening and involved in the conference to participate in if they're interested and willing. But I'm going to pose it as a question, the final question to John and Shabir. But I would like the rest of you to consider adding in a chat some of your ideas or responses. Patty Dykes asks a question in the chat that's a very practical, pragmatic kind of question. She's interested in trying to help people transition from an authoritative view, at least the negative aspects of that, to a more nurturant, whether that's the Christian community, the Muslim community, other communities. What are some of the ways or things we might do to help encourage that transition? Obviously, if we're not authoritative, we're not going to force it. But what are some practical kinds of things we might think about to help a transition from a more authoritative view of God and reality to a more nurturant one? I'd love to hear from John and Shabir, but the rest of you, please type in some of your responses and answers in the chat box.
So, Patty, this is an excellent question. When I get asked a lot, every time after I present this at universities or wherever I'm speaking. And let me say a couple of things very quickly. One, people who are strongly authoritative, it's going to take a very long time to change those neural networks. It's not easily done, but it can be done. That's the hope. Neurogenesis is possible. So we can. Here is very quickly some practical things to do. When you're sitting around the table, you're talking, bring up instances in which they did not get what they deserved. Some teacher, some person in their life gave them something that was gracious and they didn't have to and they didn't deserve it. Ask them about times where they helped other people. You have to make neural connections with nurturing aspects that they have in their memory. And then being gracious to them, even when it's very difficult. So in my book, I talk about the story of a young woman who was raised in the Baptist church, Westboro Baptist Church in Kansas. That is this tiny little, like 40 people, but has become worldwide famous. God hates everybody but them. They're the only true believers. And she was raised in that, her parents. And online, she was told that every outsider hates them and they're only trying to trick you. But one outsider online asked, why do you hold these ideas? And just gently, over the course of a year of conversations online, she came to reject those views and knew that it meant that her parents would never speak to her again. Very, very hard to come out of that, but it can happen. So there's hope. The other thing I believe that's important is to theologically just to be aware of different views. Most of I taught at evangelical colleges for many decades. They were not aware there's different views of hell. They're not aware there's different views of God's nature. They're not aware different views of even baptism, for instance. I mean, it's just crazy. So helping them understand these different views, and particularly different understandings of God, and looking at, if they're authoritative, looking at biblical texts, like Shabir has done with the Quran, and others are doing. Work with them where they're at, with what they take for granted. So if they take a prayer, for instance, I found this very helpful in certain evangelical traditions. Say, well, do you think prayer has an effect on God? Well, yes. Okay, if you admit that, okay, this has big implications for the divine nature now, right? So these are ways of trying to start where people are and work with them.
Yeah, I support everything that Dr. Sanders has just said. And I would just like to approach the question from a different angle. So Patty mentioned, social and political circumstance. I think one of the things that can can bring people together and to also support a nurturing view is our mutual interest in battling climate change, or at least limiting the harmful effects of climate change. So we can bring out from our sacred traditions all of the things that will help us to forward this goal of being more environmentally conscious, reducing, recycling, and rethinking waste and all of that. So from the Quran, for example, we can bring out many passages, like the fact that God says in the 30th chapter that corruption has appeared on land and sea because of what human hands have wrought. So that's placing the responsibility on us for the harms that we're doing to our environment, and placing the responsibility now on us for us to reverse those harms. So if we can get people to rally together in adopting this common social cause, then that will not only bring people together, but it will bring people together in the nurturing view of God and our responsibility to help God in nurturing creation.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you, Shabir. And thank you, John, both of you. This has been a fantastic lecture, response, and then dialogue. Thanks for your contribution. We're now at that place in the conference where we're shifting to a conclusion. And as the co-sponsors and directors and associates were thinking about how we might conclude, we scheduled a brief kind of summary time. And Mohamed and Manuel, and maybe me, depending on how much time we have, we're going to say a few short words, not trying to summarize absolutely everything that's been said, because that just won't work, but maybe some insights, maybe some things that we might do going forward. Mohamed, why don't you lead in that summary exercise?
Okay. I have 2 or 3 remarks. Open theism emphasizes that God accompanies us in the here and now, and relies on us humans. So he lets himself be surprised by our actions. At the same time, this thought implies a great responsibility on the part of man, because God relies on his actions. We need a different understanding of belief in God beyond the idea that it's all about believing that God exists. Belief must develop into a dynamic process of action. Criteria for evaluating ethical action play a central role here. For me, the question remains open. To what extent is our Muslim-Christian conversation about theoretical draft beyond practice? How can concepts such as the modernization of Islam be put into practice? Who are the actors responsible here? Is it the regimes of the Islamic State, as I asked before? Is it the scholars? And if so, which scholars? In conclusion, I would like to raise one point. I have noticed that when we talk about new approaches to religion, one aspect that we quickly lose sight of is the question of identity. Religions, especially Islam in the situation of migration, are an important source of self-discovery for many Muslims as minorities in Europe and Western countries. This is an important and enriching resource, but at the same time, it makes change difficult. The acceptance of other ideas or approaches suddenly appear as an uncertainty of identity. Again and again, I experience that the restrictive understanding of religion that John criticized, and rightly so, and I share his criticism, that this understanding is attractive to many because it provides very clear guidelines, and that helps many to orient themselves. in my opinion, this is a lasting challenge in our topic: the attractiveness of authority, the attractiveness of an authoritarian God versus a loving and merciful one. So I am excited to and waiting to and I hope we will continue this conference maybe in some months and go deeply to this or that question. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Tom and Manuel, please.
Thank you, Mohammed. That was excellent. A nice insight. Manuel, thoughts?
Yeah, I will keep it very briefly. I absolutely loved all the contributions to this conference, and especially the ones today. I loved what Adis Duderia and Dave Andrews had to say, and Catherine Keller and Johannes Grössel, John Sanders and Shabir Ali. I learned so much, and I have a lot to digest. I could highlight like tons of insights I got today. One of them was from Catherine Keller. I found that enormously promising in her presentation. The insight that, or the notion of an entangled difference that doesn't diminish our differences, but emphasizes them within our entanglements. I just love the wisdom of it, and also the idea of mutual transformation regarding like interreligious dialogue. I could go on. What I just loved about Catherine Keller's input and the others too. But I would rather give the word to you, Tom. And I don't miss the opportunity. I just want to thank you, Tom, for hosting this conference. It's just I don't know how you do it, but it's as good as it gets. It's I mean the way you keep people engaged in conversation, and you take up questions of people, and it's just I'm just amazed, Tom. You're very gifted, not only as a theologian and photographer, but also as a host of you did so well. I'm very thankful that you were ready to do this.
Thank you. That's very kind of you. I've really enjoyed it. And Mohammed, thanks to you. Thanks to Asina, who perhaps some of you have realized Asina is behind the scenes, has been working on this for quite some time. She's done a masterful job of bringing things together. Also, Josh Gilbert has helped out with our technical stuff. And I want to thank all of you. I think I would like to conclude on a very personal way by talking about the deep connections I have felt with you all, but especially with my Muslim brothers, sisters, friends, as a Christian. I'm a part of not only the Christian community, but a pretty conservative branch of the Christian community. And yesterday, someone alerted me to a website in which one of my strong critics was calling me a heretic and all these sorts of things. And one of the listings was that I thought there was truth in other religions, and that's a reason why I should be kicked out of the denomination that I'm a part of, the Church of the Nazarene. And in the last few days, as we've explored these issues together, issues that are really important in terms of politics, social policy, but also personal experiences, the big questions about God, I've thought to myself that I share more in common with some of my Muslim friends, Christians as well, than I do with some of the people in my own little tiny sect of Christianity that I'm in. Like we think about the world and God more similarly than this little group and I think that's pretty beautiful. That despite the differences, and there are real differences in beliefs and practices, and I'm not trying to gloss over all those differences. We need those, as Catherine says, if we're really relational. Despite those, we also share so much in common, the way we think about God and reality, that I felt a deep kinship, a friendship in these hours, these last few days. So thank you for making that a reality for me. It's been really enriching. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Tom, for your really perfect moderation. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Well, Mohammed, Manuel, Asina, is there any last and final comments? We'll be putting these videos up once they're ready on websites. There's a book coming out, as I mentioned, eventually. It takes a while. Is there anything else I should mention, Mohammed, Manuel, Asina?
And as I told, I hope to continue this maybe in some months to make part 2 of this conference, if you like to.
Great. Would you be open to suggestions from participants in this conference on some things we might do? If so, how would people best contact you? I see you're nodding your head. Great. Maybe in the correspondence, since I have email addresses for everybody, I'll send any sort of notes we might want to send to folks for ideas. All right. Let me end by these few words. Blessings to all. Goodbye.